Yeah, they should have an English version of that. But anyway, so welcome everybody. This is one of our Palliative Bites sessions, and we are recording, as you've just seen, for colleagues who can't get here today. And I'm delighted we've got a very diverse audience, but I'm really delighted to introduce Dr. Sarah Jones. I met Sarah when I was lucky enough to be invited to speak to Leeds Bereavement Forum earlier in the year, and it was a great conference. It was focusing, I think, on the Lancet Commission, but I was intrigued to meet Sarah as a doctor who has transformed into a funeral director, and there can't be many of them around, but also to see what extraordinary stuff you are doing in Leeds with your company, Sarah. So I was going to leave you to introduce yourself, tell us your story and what you think we should all know about funerals today. So over you go, and you're going to share some slides. And
I am, yeah, fabulous. Thank you very much for the invitation. So it's quite a big subject. So I have chosen a few bits to talk about, and then Ros has explained that we'll create a bit of space at the end. So if there's anything that you were most interested in and thought, nah, why didn't you bring that up? Then we can talk about anything you want to in the last 20-25 minutes or so.
Yes, and do use the chat if you can't save your question. Yeah, do put some questions in the chat.
Although I'm not skilled enough to talk and read the chat, so okay, I apologise. I'll try, but yeah, that's probably slightly above my my competence. But yeah, so as Rob mentioned, I started my career as a medic. So I trained up in Edinburgh, and then I worked in Glasgow. I did my BST, as it was then called, shows my age. And then I was doing vascular surgery, and then I left and I initially had a care home business for adults with learning difficulties and challenging behaviour. And then in 2016, I became a funeral director, in that I started Full Circle Funerals. And the vision with that is to bring all of the health and social care principles into funeral care, which my experience had been that was quite transactional or could be quite transactional. So to try and reframe that into something that I see as part of the health and social care continuum. So I'm going to cover a few different bits and pieces. Hopefully you can see my slides and someone will help if anything goes wrong. So I thought we would just cover some basics about funeral care. Quickly pose the question about whether funerals actually matter and whether they're helpful. Obviously, I have an opinion on that, as you can imagine. You may well have your own. I want to tell you a little bit about some funeral care research that we have been involved in with a couple of universities. So touch on greener funerals, because I know that's something that for the majority of people, the environment is something that is more and more important and of greater consideration, and it's definitely relevant to funerals. Then a little bit about caring for people who have died, and then the opportunity for any questions at all. So the first thing to share maybe is just a little bit of context. So funeral care and funeral services are completely unregulated. So there are no national minimum standards, there are no code of practices that all funeral directors are obliged to adhere to. We sit under the Ministry of Justice, presumably because of a combination of the coroner services and then cemeteries. But what that means is that in terms of somebody giving direction and dictating what good looks like, and then spending time and energy ensuring that good is achieved and delivered to people who are engaging the support of service of funeral directors, that doesn't really exist. And the other thing which is interesting is that after I'd been open for about a year, I thought, right, well, I've kind of got a sense of what I think good care looks like, but what I'd like to do is just sense check that against the evidence base. So at that point, I still had access to, the places that I could do some good searches. And my husband's a medic, so I can still use his, Athens logins and things. And I thought it'd be really interesting to see what the evidence base is for funeral care. And interestingly, there wasn't very much. So in terms of the ladder of good research, most of it was just anecdote and people's opinions, rather than any really robust research looking at what is good funeral care, what is likely to lead to greater satisfaction and well-being. So that was interesting, and that prompted then some of the work that I'm going to tell you a little bit about shortly. The other thing to share is that in 2016 and then 2018, the Competition and Markets Authority had a look at funeral care, and that was prompted by above inflation price increases by two of the larger funeral care providers. And that then prompted them to have a look at funeral care and think, gosh, what kind of industry is this? And they had a look, and as part of their the focus groups that they set up, what they found out is that only 1 in 6 people shop around for a funeral director. The other 5 out of 6 just pick up the phone to the person that they had heard of. And I suppose that reflects that that coupled with the other point on the slide, which as long as the price is between £4,000 and £7,000, that kind of is a little bit vaguely what people expect. So they then feel uncomfortable and are unlikely to ask too many questions. So those two things together, I guess, lead to quite a concerning picture in terms of the chances or the risk of people's needs not being adequately met by funeral care in general, and I suppose funeral directors, specific funeral directors. So just to, that's a bit of context. And now just a little slide just to ask the question whether funerals really matter and can they help? So I guess the reason I became a funeral director is because I think they do matter, and I think they can help in some circumstances more than others. But my experience would also support now that they can support a growing acceptance of loss, particularly in more challenging or sudden circumstances. The funeral can reflect the person who's died and then have personal meaning for the people who are present. And the emotional labour, which can be involved in making the choices and engaging in activities between somebody dying and the funeral itself, and then afterwards, really can be very consoling. And that's certainly the feedback that we get. I would argue that the role of the funeral director is changing, and that historically it was very much about upholding tradition and making sure that people did what they needed to do in order to fulfill the rites that were sort of pre-described. Whereas now the role of the funeral director does seem to generally be morphing into more of a facilitative role and more about sharing information and creating space for people then to create the events and the rituals that are helpful for them. And that can, I guess, what drives what they need and their choices will very much be dictated by their life experience, their spirituality, their beliefs, who they feel connected to and who they were as a person. And ultimately, what I would love to know, and a question that we continue to ask and are looking for an answer to, is whether really good funeral care and a really positive funeral experience can have some sort of therapeutic benefit, which I know is a big stretch, but maybe that could lead to better physical and mental well-being and outcomes months and years down the line. Not saying they do, just asking the question. So as I've alluded to, I was quite keen to see what the evidence base was for good funeral care, and I had started to quite strongly believe that actually funerals can have an impact on long-term well-being. But what I was very conscious of is that there is no evidence to support that. Lots of people anecdotally will tell you they believe that too, but there isn't any evidence really that supports that belief. So I wanted to know whether funerals can have an impact on long-term well-being. And as I've suggested, the literature review really showed quite limited evidence and limited work in this space. So what I've done is the images seem slightly random, but I've just dotted some images around that just show a little bit about some choices. So there might be a few coffins and things that you've seen before or not seen before, but it just to nod a little bit to the range of what's possible. So with respect to the research, I then emailed lots of people who seem to be doing research on death, dying, and bereavement, and said, I think this is really important. And I now count as a practitioner, and everybody likes a good academic practitioner partnership. So I said, this is something I would really like to explore. And lots of people, of course, didn't answer. And then one lady was obviously too kind to not answer and didn't want to be rude. So said, well, I'll meet you for coffee, clear with the intention of saying, no, thank you. And then we had our coffee. And at the end, we agreed, actually, this was a really important question and something that maybe we could look to work on together. So that led to a partnership with University of York. And the first piece of work that we did together, which I'll share a little bit of with you, was asking the question, what actually matters to people who have arranged a funeral? Because I came with this big question, you know, do funerals, what's the long-term impact of funerals? And Julie, my co-researcher, quite rightly said, well, what is a funeral, and what bits of a funeral actually matter? And, you know, she had lots of very clever academic questions that, again, we didn't have the answers to, and we needed to go and find out first. So the first piece of work was a qualitative piece of research where we interviewed over 50 people in there was a topic guide in a semi-structured way, but effectively just asked people to talk us through their funeral experience. And then Julie did the very clever qualitative theme analysis and came out with themes that came up time and time again as being important drivers for people's funeral experience and satisfaction. And I'll share those with you. And then what that piece of work did is it prompted a second piece of work, because what we found is that people were sharing their experiences, and there was quite a lot being said about how people were being cared for after death, the physical care of people after death. And because it was such an open-ended initial conversation, we didn't really ask any specifics, but some really quite important things were said, and it felt that needed further exploration. So our second piece of work looked into that. And then the third piece of research that is currently, I guess, taking up most of our time is we're now working with York and Bradford University, and that is about trying to develop a funeral experience score. And the hope with that is if there's a validated score, then all of the amazing work that people, research that people are doing into end-of-life care, carers' experiences, and within the palliative world, hopefully what we can do is then deliver a score that can be used as a way to measure the funeral as a variable. Because what we found is that lots of times it's being asked about, but it's being asked about in quite a loose way, because there isn't necessarily at the moment a score that can be plugged into that question. So we're trying to develop that research tool to be used. There's a bit of work to do still, but. Okay, so the funeral experts by experience. This is an incredibly busy infographic, but I've put it up there so that I remember to tell you that it exists. So if anyone's interested, we can share that, but it summarizes the research. And what we found is that there were 5 factors that people consistently talked about as part of their arranging experience and their funeral experience. And the first of those was whether the wishes were known. So people talked extensively about how challenging it was if somebody's funeral wishes weren't known, particularly if there were any complex dynamics within the family. And they talked about how difficult that was and how that disrupted the decision-making within the family. But they also shared how helpful it was if any wishes at all were known. And the lovely thing was, it didn't matter if it was one wish, so one song or one instruction, or whether it was an incredibly complex set of instructions that pretty much had nailed down all that different aspects of the funeral. The consolation and the act of gifting was the same. And people really talked about that. They talked about having these wishes and then being able to gift the fulfillment of those wishes and how meaningful and consoling that was for them. So that was the first thing that came out loud and clear. The second was whether decision-making was inclusive. Now, we all know that most of us, me included, have some interesting family dynamics to navigate at the best of times. And of course, making funeral arrangements, that can be tricky because people are brought together into a room that maybe wouldn't choose to be making decisions together under other circumstances. Now, what most people reported was that actually people wanted to put their differences aside for the funeral and then pick up their differences again afterwards. But where people had felt they had been completely excluded from decision making and felt very disenfranchised, they were the people who were most dissatisfied. The third factor was whether the funeral director was responsive, and that was about the funeral director understanding the need and then adapting their style and tone to meet that need. And I guess the example that probably illustrates that the best is that one person who participated in the study, a young man who suddenly found himself needing to make funeral arrangements, hadn't ever even begun to think, hadn't even been to a funeral. Whereas another lady, I think it was her 16th funeral that she had arranged in 5 years, because she was the go-to person in the family. She was the one who did this. So she was the one who always stepped forward. And she was actually incredibly experienced. And what those two people need from funeral directors and from funeral care, of course, are very different, because they come at things with a very different amount of experience, knowledge, and they need very different things. And I guess how they were responded to made a big difference to how satisfied people were. The fourth related to contact with the body, so physical contact and time spent with the person who's died. Now, as everyone I'm sure in the room knows, that can happen at very different times along the extended funeral timeline. So that might happen at the time when someone dies, it might happen somewhere after somebody's died, but that's not at the funeral service. That might happen at the funeral service, or it might happen at home, for example, in the days before the funeral, or it could happen at the funeral itself if it's an open coffin funeral. But the key there is whether that was a helpful experience. So if people didn't choose to do that, was that the right thing for them? And if people did choose to, did that experience live up to what they needed it to do? And there was a huge range in what people needed and wanted. And as I've said, some people had some really challenging experience, and some people had some incredibly beautiful experiences. And we decided to look at that in a little bit more detail in the next piece of work. And then the final one is whether the funeral event met expectations. And the big thing that came out that maybe was a little unexpected or interesting to see is a lot of the people making the arrangements almost had their needs met in the time up to the funeral. They had maybe spent time with the person, maybe they had chosen some clothes that were really meaningful. Putting together the slideshow meant that they'd spent time thinking about the right photographs and thinking about memories. And for quite a few of those people, they described the funeral itself as actually almost an event for someone else. That was about then putting it all together and doing and creating something that others, maybe the wider circle of friends and family or the community, could engage in, less that they needed something from that because they had had the opportunity to do what they needed to do leading up to it. So, I mean, it's a big report. There's the infographic, there's lots around that, but that's a kind of, I guess, that hopefully at least shares the 5 factors, which then form the basis of some of the other work that we have done. So the second bit that I've mentioned was then, I suppose, a spin-off project, which was really trying to explore people's ideas, concerns and expectations from care after death. So I don't know if anyone else, so when I went to medical school, there was a new module called Patients' Ideas, Concerns and Expectations. And this was new in Edinburgh when I was there. And for some reason, that phrase has really stuck. So it's now found itself in this research project. But what we did is we spoke to participants, again, in a very open way, but specifically about what they were expecting. What did they think happened to somebody after they were brought into the care of a funeral director? And what did they think how did they think people moved around, and how were they looked after, and what did those spaces look like? And then we asked a lot of questions about what kind of involvement they wanted to have. What involvement did they have? What decisions were they part of? What conversations were had and which conversations weren't had? And then we also surveyed 272 funeral directors, and we asked them about their practice. So we asked them what they did. They asked them why they did it like that. So we asked them the practical bits, but we also asked them about what sorts of things they would do without discussion with a family, and what sorts of things would they only do with consent. And if they sought consent, how were they doing that, and what did those conversations look like? And as you can imagine, that was interesting, to say the least. Because if you, I guess, take the two things where you have an industry which is unregulated, and funeral directors, broadly speaking, are doing what they think is right. And I personally believe that comes from a good place, but they are doing what they think is right and what they've been taught. And then you have a subject that people don't like to talk about too much. So I guess the general public probably don't know quite as much about this as maybe they do about other things. So I mean, to take again a big report and a big subject and condense it into 4 key points, most people had really strong assumptions about the standards that funeral directors were working to and the training that funeral directors receive. So it was a strong assumption that funeral directors are trained professionals. And one person even commented, like doctors are, there's that sense that they're trained, and it's really not like that. So, they're trained, and you have these professional standards, and you have these qualifications that you have to achieve, and somebody is regulating this and looking at it. And the other big thing that came out is that people have really different expectations. So on one extreme, you'd have somebody who's incredibly squeamish And the thought of having a conversation about a dead body just horrifies them. So they don't want to know, they don't want to talk about it. And this is not something they want to be involved in. And actually, it's just a stretch to even think about this as a thing. And then the other hand, you've got somebody who actually wants to be involved in that, delivering that personal care. They would like to wash someone's hair. They would like to dress them. They would like to do their nails. And if you're going to be talking about things like setting facial features or where somebody's being kept, they want to see that, and they want to see the stuff that you're using, and they want to agree to that before that's happening, because you're looking after their person and they've looked after them for months and years and maybe delivered an awful lot of hands-on care, and they're not going to, you don't get to take that away just because that person's moved into your care. And the challenge, of course, is knowing which person you're supporting and therefore how to meet that need. And then, as I've alluded to, funeral directors had really different practice, which is not unexpected, really. And that varied from the sorts of facilities that the funeral directors use, how they frame those conversations, the sorts of conversations they thought were appropriate, at what point they would deliver different types of care, the sorts of physical interventions that they would routinely do and not. And again, I'm happy to talk about this in a bit more detail, but I'm conscious I don't know exactly who's in the room. So I'll maybe wait to see if people want to know more about the detail of that later. And the other thing that was very interesting is again, it came up how we have some professional silos. So you have people maybe working in community or hospice or hospitals delivering care. Then you have a mortuary often. Then you have funeral directors, and then you maybe have people who work in cemeteries and crematoria. And actually how, from the family's perspective, that's just a continuum. They don't necessarily feel where one starts and the other one ends. But actually, there's maybe an argument that we're not quite so good at understanding what each other does and how that might impact. And for example, there's specific things that might relate to. So for example, medical implants, and at what point they come in and how it's communicated, whether they've come out and when they need to come out, or whether somebody's left some wishes about how they want to be physically cared for after death. And if that translates from an end-of-life care plan or advanced care plan into the funeral director ever finding out that those were the wishes. So that's led to, I guess, more conversations about how we can think across that continuum and all ultimately have more consistent ways of supporting families and carers together. And then I've mentioned the piece of work. So this is sort of the main bulk of our work at the moment with York and Bradford, and that's to take the 5 factors and turn that into a validated experience score, I guess a bit like a pain score, but for how your funeral experience, how you would rate your funeral experience. So we've completed the pilot, and there's now the university people, because I do not understand this in the slightest, are now going through the funding applications, and the hope is that will then become a large-scale project which will result in a research tool that can be utilised in all of the amazing thorough work that's already going on, and that actually that funeral variable can be added into the mix. Okay, so I'm now going to come in an abrupt, not even the nicest, neatest segue. I'm just going to leave research and we're going to swoop over to green funerals. So again, there's an awful lot to say on this. So I'm just going to give a very brief kind of nod to some of the main things, and we can come back to it if this is something that people are interested about at the end. So there are greener choices than others, would be my headline. And given the number of people who die every year, this makes a contribution to the planet, the choices that people make. And there are lots of different nuances to this, but there are probably 3 main things really. One is the choice of coffin and its entire life cycle. So from the production of raw materials to coffin getting to funeral director and then getting to wherever the committal is taking place. The second is the committal, so whether somebody chooses cremation, burial, or some of the alternatives that are becoming available. And then the third is what people do afterwards. So if there is a location, for example, a headstone or a plaque at a crematorium, or another location that people repeatedly visit, so maybe initially weekly, then monthly, then the choice of that location and how they go there has a significant environmental impact. And that doesn't really matter whether that's cremation or burial. The key is that there is a location that people are repeatedly visiting, and that probably has a really long-term environmental impact if that's that is way above the scope of the actual funeral itself. And then there's other bits and pieces. So as you probably know, the funeral industry at the moment runs predominantly on big diesel cars, and flowers come in from very far and wide. There's a lot of criticism about the little flower pots that are on headstones, because then people feel obliged to continue to fill those again with flowers, which have probably had quite a significant environmental footprint getting there. So they're the kind of major bits. And then most people are firstly interested in the relative impact of the different committal options. So natural burial is currently regarded in the UK as the most environmentally friendly choice. So natural burial involves a single depth burial. And because it's single depth, that means that the decomposition is aerobic as opposed to anaerobic, therefore less greenhouse gases are emitted. Everything that goes in is biodegradable. There can be no grave litter, which is the rather I guess unglamorous term for things that people would bring, so the cellophane around the flowers and the non-biodegradable things that people might bring to a grave when they're visiting, and everything planted on it needs to be native species. So this is a picture of a natural burial ground, and what the family have done before the burial is they've come and they've dressed the grave. So they've brought things from the lady's garden and they've put them around so that when she arrives, she's entering something that has things from her garden within it. A woodland burial, which you're probably familiar with, may also be a natural burial ground, or it may not be. It could be a traditional burial ground where you plant a tree. So it can be a little bit tricky sometimes to navigate what's what. So flame cremation is the commonest choice in the UK. 77% of people choose flame cremation. And that's quite challenging from an environmental perspective, because of course they run on fossil fuels. And there is significant concerns that there is air pollution as a result of the cremation process. So there are abatement schemes, so particularly for mercury. Old fillings used to have mercury in them, and there were a lot of concerns about what happened to the mercury during cremation. So there are some abatement schemes. My understanding is that I think it's about 40% of cremators in the UK at the moment actually have an abater in them. There's a move to electric cremators, so to try and move away from fossil fuels. And there's also some innovation that people are trying out where the heat generated by cremation is used efficiently. So this the kind of cut-off headline is that there's a in Redditch they trialed using the heat from the crematorium to heat the town swimming pool. So I guess sort of leaning a little bit towards more circular economy type principles. Then some of you may have heard of water cremation. So water cremation is a process where it's alkaline hydrolysis. So you can see a picture of a water cremator on this slide. The person is placed inside, the autoclave door is closed, there's no coffin, and then water and alkali are placed inside the chamber, and under high pressure, the water cremation takes place. We can see people frowning. Yeah, this is a bit of a love or hate. People are either like, yeah, I want that, or they're like, no. So this has been used by farms, I think, for a very long time. So the concept is not, for kind of larger animals, is not new, but yeah, so this is what it would look like for humans. And the process takes 3 to 4 hours. So after the water cremation, you also have ashes like you do for flame cremation, but those ashes are white as opposed to, I don't know how many of you have seen them, but that kind of grey and darker colour, and there is more of them. So now this is currently used a lot in the US and in places in Europe. And the first resumatorium in the UK will be opening in the next few months up in the northeast of England. So yes, this will be available in a place near you. No, this will be available in this country, certainly in 2023. And then I think the vision is once they've established the first resumatorium and they've kind of worked out the processes relating to that, then I suspect there will be many more, and this will become a readily available option for people in the UK in the not too distant future. The issue with it is it's not regulated for or against, because it's a new thing. So there's nothing to say it can't happen, but there was nothing to say it could. So of course they've had to build all of the paperwork and things around it to make sure that it's safe. And then the other one of the other things which is happening elsewhere I think we will have to wait for this one a little while, but is human composting. So this is a picture rather than an actual place at the moment, but this is what they're aspiring to have. So this is currently, this has been approved in Washington, and this is where a person is placed inside a sealed vessel with wood chip, I'm going to say this word and I say it wrong every time, alfalfa and straw. Oxygen is added, and apparently after 30 days compost is created, and then people arrive and they take their compost away. Some people think this is wonderful and that it would be absolutely the way to go. I understand there's quite a lot of compost, so there are also some concerns about actually how practical that is and where you're going to put it and what is it going to be like. But this is already a thing which is happening. You know, you often hear about new things that sound wonderful, but this is actually happening. And we've actually had 2 people now who have specifically wanted to buy a funeral plan which involves them being taken here, and they've paid for their human composting in advance. So this does appeal to certain people, yeah, it's happening, so it felt worth mentioning. Okay, and then another completely abrupt, non-lovely, smooth segue to the next topic is a little bit of kind of care after death, because when I've spoken in the past to people who work in health and social care, some of these practical bits just seem, you know, worth mentioning. So as I've said, we definitely have a tendency, certainly where we are, I don't know whether it's different in other parts of the country, to operate in care silos, really, and what people maybe experience on the ward, then what they experience in the hospital mortuary, what they then experience at the funeral director can be quite different, and the amount of agency given to the body and the amount of time spent garnering the wishes of the family can be quite different depending on which bit of the continuum people sit on, which I think can be quite disruptive for people. So as I've mentioned, as we're unregulated, there are no rules about how a funeral director looks after somebody after death. So some funeral directors will have state-of-the-art facilities. Some of the larger funeral directors have large mortuary hubs where they specialize, everybody in that hub is specialized in delivering care to people after death, and then they would have their funeral services out in the community, and people would move to and from those services, but they're cared for in one very state-of-the-art specialist hub. Other funeral directors like us would have a smaller service with a smaller on-site mortuary that has its own temperature controlled unit and has the kind of kit needed to move and handle safely. But there are also plenty of funeral directors who either rent space, either in a hospital or from another funeral director, or funeral directors who don't have a mortuary. They either have a cooled room or maybe don't have any space at all. And because there aren't any rules against that, it's about funeral directors sort of deciding what they think is appropriate and the right way to care for people. So I've mentioned a little bit the value of wishes. So it can, funeral wishes generally are incredibly helpful to guide the conversations about what someone wants. But if somebody has specific wishes about how they would like to be cared for, that's also really helpful. So for example, some people might say, do you know what, I need to look my finest, make sure I've got my lippy on and I'm looking glam, and that's the dress I think I look best in, and before anybody sees me, I need to be looking good, you know, don't show me up. Other people might say, do you know what, I've spent the last couple of months having so much treatment and so many people fussing, please just leave me alone, just keep me safe, put me somewhere that will that I should be, and then just leave me well alone. And at that point, I just don't want anybody fussing with me. And both of those are actually, it's very different. Both of those are entirely possible. And the key is that act of fulfilling those wishes is still very helpful for a family and guides a lot of their decisions and satisfaction from what we see anyway. The issue of family and or carer involvement is an interesting one. And quite a tricky one to navigate. You guys are probably familiar with the GMC guidance about facilitating difficult conversations. And I guess after lots of deliberation, we concluded that actually we would just follow the same, because you don't know how much somebody wants to, you can do harm by opening conversations and telling people things that they don't want to know. But you can miss opportunities for people to be involved in things that they would find very meaningful if you don't have any conversation at all. So we follow the same principles, which is you open up the conversation. in a gentle way. And then you can always, if that door is gently opened and somebody pushes against it and wants to know a little bit more, then you just keep telling them more and more in increments, and you keep giving the opportunity to say, actually, I've had enough now. That's enough detail for me. I feel like I can make the decisions I need to. But this is a really tricky one. And I think one that we'd certainly need guidance and some standards on, because this is really quite a tricky area of what we do. I've mentioned the removal of devices because that can be interesting from a funeral director's perspective, because sometimes we have no clue what people work from, particularly now that lots of things are digital and go straight to the registrars and the bereavement services. Sometimes we just have to guess if somebody has a pacemaker or not, or we have to take it from the family whether they do or don't. It's quite hard. Obviously, if it's been removed, we can often tell whether somebody's got an implantable defibrillator or a fixie nail. It's really tricky. So I'm going to leave it with a little ask in the situations to do that, because anything with a battery can't go into a cremator. You have to make sure that they are removed before it goes to the crematorium, and that's really hard to do if you don't know what somebody has in the first place. And we don't see the medical certificate. We nowadays often don't even see Crem 4. So the only thing that we get is the registrar certificate, which doesn't even have a date of birth on it. And then we have to go on what the family tell us. It can be really difficult to find that information. There we go. Yeah, so just a couple of parting thoughts and then a bit of time.
We're just losing you a bit, Sarah. I don't know if it's your internet.
Oh, maybe. Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Don't know. How long have I been waffling on inaudibly for? You're
fine. No.
Okay.
You missed a few words.
Okay. Okay, super. So yeah, just some parting thoughts. So I think the key thing is that knowledge is power. So that's knowledge between all of us in understanding what each of us does maybe work, but also ultimately that person's experience. The second parting thought is about that facilitating decision making. If we find out that somebody has a specific wish or something is important to a family, or that everybody else then is going to go on to support that person knows that. Wishes really matter. They really, really matter. And I know there's so much that we want to encourage people to express their wishes about. But if there's any way you encourage people to just leave one little wish about their funeral, the impact that has on the people then making those arrangements is really significant. And as I've said, it could just be one really small thing. I'd like to be wearing my slippers. But it's really, really significant to the family. And there's a lot of consolation in fulfilling those wishes. And I think the other thing is just, we can all have a really positive impact with this, just in really small ways. So just opening up the conversation, sharing what little information that we feel that we know and that's relevant, and talking to each other. And I think that's all I've got. I shall stop sharing, and I hope I've covered at least something interesting for everyone.
You have covered so much. The research, we'd love those infographics, which we can share with everybody on the call.